Story number 1.
It wasn't supposed to snow until the following evening. That's what the forecast said. Mike, Lena, and Rob had been planning this camping trip for months. They chose January specifically because of its quiet isolation, but they didn't expect a storm, certainly not one this early. The hike to their planned site was uneventful, though the chill in the air was sharper than they had anticipated. Their backpacks were loaded with gear: four-season tents, insulated sleeping bags, and a propane stove. They'd done winter camping before. They knew the risks. By the time they reached the clearing surrounded by dense pine trees, the sun was already sinking. Gray clouds gathered on the horizon, and flurries began to drift lazily from the sky. "We should set up fast," Mike said, glancing up. "Looks like it's coming in earlier than expected." "I thought you said this was a perfect weekend for camping," Lena teased, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. "It was," Mike shot back, smirking. "Blame the weather app, not me." "Guys," Rob interrupted, gesturing to the clearing. "We need to get moving." They worked quickly, setting up the tents and building a fire. By the time darkness fell, the snow was falling steadily and the wind had picked up. The fire crackled in front of them, offering a fleeting sense of warmth and security. "I don't know," Lena said quietly, staring into the flames. "This place feels strange." Rob looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, uneasy. "I don't know, just feels heavy, like something's watching us." Mike laughed, but it sounded forced. "It's the trees. They're all packed in close. It messes with your head." Lena didn't respond. She stared into the forest, the shadows between the trees twisting with each gust of wind. The snow intensified, and they retreated to their tents after finishing a quick meal. The storm outside was relentless, the wind battering the walls and the snow piling up around the stakes. Mike and Rob shared one tent while Lena took the other, and soon the campsite fell silent except for the howling wind. Lena woke with a start sometime in the middle of the night. She didn't know why at first, but something felt wrong. She lay still, listening. The wind was still roaring, but there was another sound, faint and intermittent, cutting through the storm. It was a voice. "Hello?" Lena's heart thudded in her chest. She strained to hear over the wind, and the voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me." She bolted upright, her breath freezing in her throat. It was a woman's voice, distant but unmistakable. She reached for her flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The storm was blinding, the snow swirling in chaotic patterns, but there was no one there, no tracks, just endless white. "Hello?" Lena called hesitantly. "Is someone out there?" The voice didn't answer, and for a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Then it came again, closer. "Help me." She scrambled out of her sleeping bag and into her boots, not bothering to lace them properly. She rushed to Mike and Rob's tent, unzipping it with trembling hands. "Wake up," she hissed. Mike groaned. "What's wrong?" "There's someone out there," Lena said. "I heard them calling for help." Rob sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she insisted. It was a woman. She sounded hurt. The two men exchanged uneasy looks but grabbed their flashlights and jackets. They stepped out into the storm, their beams cutting through the darkness. The wind bit at their faces and the cold was almost unbearable. "Hello?" Mike shouted, his voice barely audible over the gale. "Is anyone out here?" Nothing. "Maybe it was the wind," Rob suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "No," Lena said firmly. "It was a voice." As they stood there, a noise came from the trees, a faint, shuffling sound. Their flashlights swung toward it, illuminating the edge of the forest. A figure stood there, just barely visible through the snow. It was a woman, barefoot and pale, wearing what looked like a torn nightgown. Her head was down, her hair hanging in damp strands around her face. "Holy," Mike muttered, stepping back instinctively. "Ma'am," Rob called out, taking a cautious step forward. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't move. The wind whipped around her, but she stood unnaturally still, almost like a statue. "Something's wrong," Lena whispered, her gut twisting. Then the woman lifted her head. Her face was wrong. The features were blurred, as if smeared like wet paint. Where her eyes should have been, there were only dark hollows. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a low, guttural moan escaped, cutting through the storm like a knife. "Run!" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural. That was all it took for them to bolt, stumbling through the deep snow toward the tents. They dove inside, zipping the flaps shut and pulling their sleeping bags around them as if the thin fabric could offer any real protection. "What the hell was that?" Mike hissed, his eyes wide with panic. Lena shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. I don't know." The storm outside raged on, but now it wasn't just the wind. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the tents, and then the voice came again, impossibly close. "Help me." Lena pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but it was everywhere. It was inside her head, reverberating in her skull. The others were pale, frozen in terror. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, even with the storm still roaring. And then, something scratched at the tent, a slow, deliberate drag of nails against the fabric. None of them moved. The scratching stopped, replaced by a faint, wet breathing. It hovered just outside, so close they could almost feel it. Then suddenly it was gone. The wind roared back to life, and the voice faded into the storm. They didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, weak and pale through the clouds, they emerged from the tents cautiously. The snow had stopped, and the clearing was eerily quiet. There were no tracks, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. The three of them packed up in silence, their faces drawn and pale. No one spoke until they were back in the car, driving away from the forest as fast as the icy roads would allow. "What was that?" Lena whispered, staring out the window. "What did we see?" Neither Mike nor Rob answered. They didn't know. None of them ever went camping again. Story the end.
Story number 2.
We decided to go camping in late January, even though most people would call us crazy. The mountains were beautiful in the winter, and the snow-covered trees looked like something out of a postcard. It was supposed to be a fun getaway. Just me, my brother Matt, and our friend Lisa. We had all the gear we needed. Insulated tents, plenty of layers, and enough food to last us for 3 days. The forecast called for some snow, but nothing major. We figured we could handle it. The first day was uneventful. We hiked up to our favorite spot, a flat clearing surrounded by towering pines with a small frozen lake nearby. The snow was light, just enough to crunch underfoot. We set up camp, made a fire, and sat around sharing stories and laughing. By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags that night, the wind had picked up a little, but it wasn't anything we hadn't dealt with before. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The tent was dark, and Matt was snoring softly beside me. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of the trees. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable, a voice. "Hello?" I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was high-pitched, almost childlike. I strained to listen, thinking I might have imagined it, but it came again. "Hello? Can you hear me?" I shook Matt awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He groaned and rubbed his eyes. "Hear what?" The voice. He sat up, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then, faintly, it came again. "Help me." Matt's eyes widened. "What the hell?" Lisa must have heard it too, because she unzipped her tent and poked her head out. "Are you guys hearing that?" she asked, her voice shaking. We all stepped out into the freezing night air, our flashlights cutting through the swirling snow. The storm had picked up and the wind was howling, but the voice was still there. "Help me, I'm lost." It sounded close, but we couldn't see anything beyond the wall of snow and darkness. "We have to check it out," Matt said, grabbing his coat. "Are you crazy?" Lisa hissed. "It's the middle of the night, and we're in the middle of a storm. What if we get lost too?" Matt hesitated, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Please, I need help." It sounded so desperate, so human. I felt a pang of guilt at the thought of ignoring it. "We'll just look for a minute," I said. "If we don't see anything, we'll come back." Reluctantly, Lisa agreed. The three of us grabbed our flashlights and trudged into the woods, calling out as we went. "Hello? Where are you? Can you hear us?" The voice didn't respond. Instead, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the wind dying down as the snow fell heavier. The deeper we went, the stranger it felt. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches heavy with snow. "Something's not right," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right." I was about to agree when Matt stopped abruptly. "Did you see that?" he whispered, pointing ahead. I squinted into the darkness, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. "Who's there?" Matt called out, his voice firm. No answer. We pressed on, though every instinct in me screamed to turn back. The air felt heavier, colder, like it was pressing down on us. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the voice came again. Over here. It was louder now, almost a whisper in my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. We need to go back, Lisa said, her flashlight shaking in her hand. This isn't right. Matt looked torn, but he nodded. Okay, let's go. We turned around and started back toward camp, but the path looked different. The trees all seemed the same, their branches twisted and reaching out like claws. The snow was deeper, the trail we'd made already buried. Are we going the right way? Lisa asked, panic creeping into her voice. We have to be, Matt said, though he didn't sound convinced. We walked for what felt like hours, but the camp never appeared. The forest seemed endless, stretching on in every direction. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Then we heard it again, behind us this time. Don't leave me. It wasn't desperate anymore. It was cold, angry. We didn't wait. We ran, stumbling through the snow, the voice following us, growing louder. You can't leave me. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, we burst into the clearing where our camp should have been, but it wasn't there. The tents, the fire pit, everything. Gone. What the hell? Matt whispered, turning in a circle. We were right here, Lisa said, her voice rising in panic. This is where we camped. It has to be. But it wasn't. The clearing was empty, the snow untouched. It was like we'd never been there. And then, from the edge of the clearing, a figure stepped into the light of our flashlights. It was a girl no older than 10, wearing a tattered coat and boots that looked decades old. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. Help me, she said, her voice the same one we'd been hearing all night. Lisa screamed, and the girl's face twisted into something horrible, her mouth stretching too wide, her eyes turning black. Help me, she repeated, her voice echoing unnaturally. We ran. I don't know how long we ran or in what direction, but eventually we stumbled out onto the main trail. Our car was there, covered in snow, as if no time had passed at all. We didn't speak as we climbed into the car and drove away, the storm still raging behind us. When we got home, we looked up the area, desperate for answers. What we found chilled us to the bone. Decades ago, a young girl had gone missing in that forest during a snowstorm. Her body was never found, and people reported hearing her cries for help on stormy nights. I don't know what we saw that night, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go camping in the snow again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The forecast called for light flurries, the kind of snowfall that would turn the forest into a postcard-perfect winter wonderland. That was the appeal for Matt, Jen, and Eric, 3 lifelong friends who had planned their annual camping trip months in advance. They wanted the isolation, the quiet, and the chance to escape from the noise of the city. They were experienced campers and confident in their abilities, even in the winter wilderness. The day started well. They hiked deep into the forest, bundled in thermal gear, their boots crunching in the thin layer of snow on the ground. By mid-afternoon, they had set up camp in a small clearing nestled between towering evergreens. The plan was simple: build a fire, cook a hot meal, and enjoy the solitude. But by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the weather had taken a turn. The gentle flurries turned into a steady snowfall, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Eric, the most seasoned of the 3, frowned as he looked at the darkening sky. This wasn't in the forecast, he said, brushing snow from his jacket. We should have brought the emergency radio. Matt shrugged. It's just snow. We've got a solid tent and enough gear. Worst case, we hunker down and ride it out. Jen didn't say anything, but she had been uneasy since they arrived. The forest had a strange energy, an almost suffocating stillness that wasn't normal. Even the occasional bird calls or rustling of small animals had been absent. She tried to shake it off as paranoia. By the time they retreated into the tent, the snowstorm had grown fierce. The wind battered the tent walls, and the temperature plummeted. They huddled close, eating freeze-dried meals and sipping from thermoses of hot tea. This is cozy, Matt joked, trying to lighten the mood. It's like we're in a snow globe. Jen forced a smile, but she couldn't shake the tension in her chest. She zipped her sleeping bag up to her chin and tried to sleep, but the wind outside seemed almost alive, wailing and shrieking in tones that made her skin crawl. It didn't help that the others had fallen asleep quickly, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Then she heard it. A voice. Faint, almost lost in the wind. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but it came again, clearer this time. "Help me." Jen sat up, her pulse racing. She strained to listen over the storm. The voice was distant but unmistakable, a woman's voice, desperate and pleading. "Help me!" She shook Eric awake, whispering urgently. "Did you hear that?" Eric groaned, sitting up groggily. "Hear what?" "Listen," Jen said, her voice trembling. They both sat in silence. The wind howled around them, rattling the tent. Then, faint but distinct, the voice came again. "Help me!" Eric's face paled. "What the hell?" He grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent. The cold wind blasted in as he shone the beam into the storm. "Hello?" he called. "Is someone out there?" The light revealed nothing but swirling snow, no movement, no tracks. "It's just the wind," Matt mumbled from his sleeping bag, barely awake. "Go back to sleep." Jen shook her head. "That's not the wind, Matt, it's a voice." Eric zipped the tent shut, his jaw tight. "It's too dangerous to go out there. If it's a person, they shouldn't be out here anyway." Jen lay back down, but she couldn't relax. The voice haunted her, coming and going with the gusts of wind. When she finally drifted into a fitful sleep, she dreamed of a pale woman standing in the snow, her eyes hollow and her mouth moving soundlessly. The next morning, the storm had eased, leaving the forest buried under a heavy blanket of snow. The trio emerged from the tent, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The clearing was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. The storm had erased all traces of their footprints, leaving the campsite pristine. "I still can't get over that voice," Jen said, breaking the silence. "It felt so real." "It was just the wind," Matt said dismissively, shaking snow off his pack. "We've got enough to worry about without scaring ourselves." Eric, however, didn't look convinced. "Let's pack up and head back to the trailhead," he said. "The storm might come back, and I don't want to take any chances." They started packing their gear, working quickly in the freezing air. Jen noticed something strange as she rolled up her sleeping bag. A single footprint, bare and human, pressed into the snow just outside the tent. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Eric," she said, her voice shaking. "Look at this." He crouched next to her, his expression darkening as he examined the print. No one's walking around barefoot in this weather. Matt joined them, his cocky demeanor faltering. "It's probably old. Maybe someone passed through before the storm." Jen shook her head. "The storm would have covered it. This is fresh." They stared at the footprint in uneasy silence. Then the wind picked up again, carrying with it a faint, mournful cry. "Help me." Jen's stomach turned. "There it is again." Eric stood abruptly. "We're leaving. Now." They strapped on their packs and set off toward the trailhead, moving as quickly as the deep snow would allow. The trees seemed darker than before, their twisted branches heavy with ice. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the forest felt, as though it was watching them. As they trudged through the snow, they began to notice more footprints, bare, human footprints that weaved in and out of their path. They were erratic, sometimes circling trees, sometimes vanishing altogether. "This is messed up," Matt muttered, his voice shaky. "It doesn't make any sense." The voice came again, louder and closer than before. "Help me." Jen spun around, her heart racing. She caught a glimpse of movement, a figure standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. It was pale, almost blending into the snow, and it stood completely still. "There's someone there," she cried, pointing. Eric and Matt turned, but the figure was gone. "Let's keep moving," Eric said, his voice tense. "Don't stop." They pushed forward, the voice following them, growing louder and more desperate. The footprints multiplied, crisscrossing their path in chaotic patterns. By the time they reached the trailhead, they were all on the verge of panic. The parking lot was empty, their car buried under a thick layer of snow. They scrambled inside, slamming the doors and locking them. Eric started the engine, the heater blasting warm air as they sat in stunned silence. "Did we all see it?" Jen asked finally. "The footprints, the figure." Matt nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, we all saw it." Eric didn't say anything. He put the car in gear and drove away, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. They never spoke about the trip again, but Jen couldn't forget. Weeks later, as she unpacked her camping gear, she found something she hadn't packed. A strip of cloth, frozen and stiff, with the words "Help me" scratched into the surface. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
We'd planned the trip for weeks. Winter camping wasn't for everyone, but for me, my older brother Eric, and his friend Natalie, it was the ultimate way to escape. No crowds, no noise, just the serenity of snow-covered wilderness. The forecast called for light snow and temperatures hovering around freezing. We were confident in our gear and experience, so we decided to head out to a secluded spot deep in the northern woods. The hike-in was breathtaking. The forest was blanketed in white, the trees heavy with fresh snow. We trudged along a narrow trail until we reached the spot Eric had scouted, a clearing near a frozen lake with enough open space to pitch our tents. The air was cold but still, and the only sounds were the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional rustle of the wind. We set up camp, started a fire, and settled in as the sun dipped behind the trees. The conversation was light, filled with jokes and memories of past trips. Around 9 p.m., the wind began to pick up. The snow started falling harder, and the fire struggled against the growing storm. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The wind outside was howling, and the tent shook under its force. At first, I thought the noise had woken me, but then I realized it wasn't just the wind. There was something else, a voice. "Hello?" I froze, straining to hear over the storm. It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but unmistakable. "Help!" I shook Eric awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned and pulled his sleeping bag tighter. "It's just the wind," he mumbled. "No, listen." The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." Eric sat up, his eyes wide. "What the hell?" Natalie must have heard it too because she unzipped her tent and peeked out. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered. We nodded, and for a moment, we all just sat there, listening. The voice came again, distant but desperate. "Help me, please." Eric grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The snow was falling heavily now, the wind whipping it into our faces. "Hello?" he called, shining the light into the woods. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the relentless wind and snow. But then, faintly, the voice returned. "Over here." It sounded closer, coming from the direction of the lake. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my coat and followed Eric and Natalie as they trudged toward the sound. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. But the voice continued, guiding us. "Please, hurry." When we reached the edge of the lake, we stopped. The voice was louder now, but there was no one there. The surface of the lake was smooth and unbroken, the snow untouched. "This is insane," Natalie said, shivering. "There's no one here." As if in response, the voice came again, this time from behind us. "Don't leave me." We all spun around, but the forest was empty. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. The voice was too clear, too close, but there was no sign of anyone. "We need to go back," Natalie said, her voice shaking. "Now." Eric nodded, and we turned to head back to camp. But as we retraced our steps, the storm seemed to grow worse. The wind howled louder, the snow falling so heavily it erased our tracks almost instantly. The woods around us felt different, unfamiliar. The trees seemed closer, their twisted branches reaching toward us like claws. After what felt like hours, we finally stumbled into the clearing. But something was wrong. Our tents were gone. The fire pit we'd built was gone. The clearing itself looked different, as if we'd never been there at all. "This isn't right," Natalie said, her voice rising in panic. "This isn't where we camped." "It has to be," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. "We couldn't have gone that far." Before we could argue, the voice returned, louder than ever. "Help me!" It was coming from the trees at the edge of the clearing. The three of us turned our flashlights in unison, and that's when we saw it. A figure stood there, just barely visible through the snow. It was a woman, her long hair matted and tangled, her clothes torn and dirty. She wasn't moving, just staring at us. "Who are you?" Eric called out, his voice trembling. The woman tilted her head, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Help me," she said, her voice echoing strangely as if it were coming from all around us. Natalie grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." Eric hesitated, but then the woman took a step closer, and we all saw it. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering, her body swaying unnaturally in the wind. "Go," I shouted, and we bolted into the woods, running blindly through the storm. The voice followed us, growing louder and more distorted. "You can't leave me." I didn't dare look back, but I could hear something behind us. Something moving too fast to be human. My lungs burned. My legs ached, but I kept running, driven by pure terror. Finally, we burst out onto the main trail. Our car was still there, half buried in snow. We piled in, slamming the doors shut and locking them. Eric fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and the engine roared to life. As we sped down the icy road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw her standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. Then, she was gone. We didn't stop until we reached a small diner on the outskirts of town. Inside, we sat in silence, trying to process what had happened. When the waitress came to take our order, Eric asked her if she'd ever heard of anything strange happening in those woods. She hesitated, then nodded. "People say the lake is haunted," she said. "Years ago, a woman drowned there during a snowstorm. They say she calls out to people, trying to lure them in." We didn't say anything after that. There was nothing to say. I haven't been camping since. The woods used to feel like a refuge, a place to escape from the chaos of the world. Now they just feel wrong, like something is waiting out there, watching, calling. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm wasn't supposed to hit until late that night. That's what the forecast said. Jack, Clara, and Nate had planned their winter camping trip meticulously, checking weather reports daily. Light flurries were expected, nothing they couldn't handle. They'd been camping together for years, always chasing the thrill of new wilderness adventures. But by mid-afternoon, the sky had turned ominously gray, and snow was already falling steadily. "This wasn't in the plan," Jack muttered, pulling his scarf tighter as the wind picked up. Clara glanced at him, her breath visible in the freezing air. "Let's just find a good spot to set up camp before it gets worse. We'll ride it out." Nate nodded, his face flushed from the cold. "We've got the gear. We'll be fine." They trudged deeper into the forest, their boots crunching through the snow. The trees were dense here, their heavy branches sagging under the weight of fresh powder. By the time they found a clearing, the snowfall had intensified. The three of them worked quickly, pitching the tent and securing it against the wind. As night fell, the storm escalated, the wind howling like a living thing. Inside the tent, they huddled together, grateful for the insulated layers of their sleeping bags. "This is kind of cozy," Nate said, trying to lighten the mood. "Like a snow day when we were kids." Jack smirked. "Yeah, except instead of hot chocolate, we've got freeze-dried stew." Clara chuckled softly, but there was a nervous edge to it. She'd camped through storms before, but something about this one felt off. The wind outside didn't sound normal. It rose and fell in eerie, almost rhythmic patterns, like whispers just beyond their hearing. As the hours dragged on, Clara struggled to sleep. The wind seemed to grow louder, carrying with it faint, indistinct sounds. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but then she heard it clearly, a voice. It was faint, almost swallowed by the storm, but unmistakable. "Help me." Her eyes snapped open, her heart racing. She held her breath, straining to listen. The voice came again, distant but desperate. "Help me." Clara shook Jack awake, her hands trembling. "Did you hear that?" Jack groaned, sitting up groggily. "Hear what?" "Listen," she whispered. The wind howled outside, and for a moment there was nothing but the relentless storm. Then the voice returned, louder this time. "Help me." Jack's face went pale. "What the hell?" Nate stirred, blinking at them groggily. "What's going on?" "There's someone out there," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I heard them calling for help." Nate frowned, grabbing a flashlight. "In this weather, they'll freeze." Jack grabbed Nate's arm before he could unzip the tent. "Wait, we don't know who or what is out there." "What do you mean, what?" Nate snapped. "It's probably someone lost or hurt." Clara nodded reluctantly. "We can't just ignore it. What if it's real?" Jack sighed, pulling on his boots and jacket. "Fine, but we stick together." The three of them stepped into the storm, the wind biting at their faces. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the swirling snow. The forest, so familiar during the day, felt alien and hostile now. "Hello?" Jack called, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "Is someone there?" The voice answered immediately, closer now. "Help me." Clara shivered, her breath hitching. The voice sounded wrong, flat, almost mechanical, like a recording. They followed the sound, their boots crunching through the deep snow. The voice continued, guiding them deeper into the woods, but no matter how far they walked, they saw no sign of anyone. "This doesn't make sense," Jack muttered, shining the flashlight in every direction. "There's no tracks. No one could be out here barefoot." Clara stopped abruptly, her eyes wide. "Barefoot?" Jack pointed to the ground, his beam illuminating a single perfectly formed footprint in the snow. It was unmistakably human, but there were no other tracks leading to or from it. Nate's voice wavered. "That's impossible." The voice came again, closer than ever. "Help me." Clara turned toward the sound and froze. A figure stood just beyond the reach of their flashlight. It was pale, almost glowing against the dark trees, and completely still. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Jack nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. Then, as the flashlight beam wavered, it vanished. Clara gasped. "Where did it go?" Nate backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "This isn't right. We need to get back to the tent. Now." They turned and started retracing their steps, but the storm had erased all traces of their path. The forest around them seemed to shift, the trees closer and more menacing than before. Jack kept glancing over his shoulder, his paranoia growing with every step. "It's following us," he whispered. Clara stopped suddenly, her eyes darting to the side. "Do you hear that?" The wind carried a new sound now, a low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable. It came from the shadows, circling them, always just out of sight. "Run," Jack said, his voice barely audible. They broke into a sprint, their breath ragged and their legs burning as they stumbled through the snow. The growling grew louder, mingling with the sound of the wind and the desperate voice. When they finally reached the tent, they collapsed inside, pulling the flap shut and securing it as best they could. The storm outside seemed to rage even harder, shaking the tent walls. "We're leaving at first light," Jack said, his voice firm. "I don't care how bad the storm is, we're not staying." Clara nodded, her hands shaking as she clutched her sleeping bag. Nate didn't say anything, his eyes fixed on the tent flap as though expecting it to rip open at any moment. The night dragged on, the storm relentless. At some point, Clara drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by images of the pale figure and the strange footprint. When she woke, the storm had stopped. The forest was silent, blanketed in pristine snow. But the tent was in shambles, its fabric shredded and their gear scattered. Surrounding the campsite were dozens of footprints, bare, human, and impossibly deep. They packed what they could and left without speaking, the oppressive silence of the forest pressing down on them. When they reached the trailhead, their car was still there, half buried in snow. They climbed inside, slamming the doors and locking them. As Jack started the engine, Clara glanced back at the forest. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing among the trees, pale and still. She didn't say anything. They never spoke about the trip again. Story the end.